Hey there, I'm Philip M. Bailey, and this is States of America with USA Today. While everyone's eyes were on the presidential election, voters considered other measures on their ballots, including decriminalization of marijuana and even heroin. We're also unpacking the fate of the nation as President Trump refuses to concede and begin the transfer of power to President-elect Joe Biden. Let's go. The need to concede. President Trump's refusal to admit defeat is one thing, but what are the ramifications of his administration withholding the transition baton from President-elect Biden? Here to discuss is Anna Ashbrenner, 2020 elections editor for USA Today. Anna, how are you?
I'm all right.
Oh, just all right. All right. All right. Anna, let me ask you, it's obvious President Trump is not conceding, and he might not concede at all, but that's not legally necessary, right? He doesn't need to legally do that for Joe Biden to be president. But explain what our reporting at USA Today has shown about his administration refusing to cooperate with Biden.
So you're right. He doesn't need to concede. There's no requirement that he, come out and say, I lost this election. But there are some mechanisms in the federal government as a new president comes in that need to start functioning. The Biden transition team is supposed to have access to office space, supposed to have access to government email addresses, and some funding that just sort of helps them transition the government, basically. That also includes access to intelligence briefings. And there is money set aside for that. Now, it has not been released yet. I think it's about $9 million. And so that is holding things up a little bit. The Biden team, though, has said they're full steam ahead no matter what.
Yeah, and the reason I bring this up is because, you saw, a lot of conservative hawks like former Congressman Mike Rogers bring that issue up about the relationship we have to the rest of the world and the incoming president needing to have some of that vital information. Break it down for us, though. What is the GSA? What does it stand for? And why does it matter in the transition?
Sure. So the GSA is the General Services Administration, and they're really responsible for the function of government. Do you have paper? Do you have desk space? Do you have access to the physical needs of an office? But they help facilitate that transition between two different administrations. There's offices that need clearing out, new people are moving in, making sure everyone has the equipment they need. And so the head of that department has said, once we ascertain who the winner is, then we'll sign off on this use of funds. But an ascertainment has not been made.
Have we ever seen this before? I mean, we've had some acrimony between presidential candidates before, but we haven't had a transition maybe of a president who's been fired by the American people since George H.W. Bush in 1992. Have we ever seen a breakdown of communication like this between the outgoing and incoming administration before?
I mean, in the modern era, absolutely not. I think when President Trump won, I think it was the day after the election, the Obama administration signed off on those transition funds. It's generally a pretty collegial environment. The outgoing president invites the president-elect to kind of get a lay of the land at the White House. The outgoing first lady and incoming first lady have conversations. It's been a generally sort of understood period of transition.
And none of that is happening right now. I think I even read that First Lady Melania Trump hasn't reached out to Dr. Jill Biden at all. But we may see that change once these legal challenges by the Trump campaign are exhausted. You alluded to this earlier, Anna, but what is President-elect Biden doing to counter the lack of transition cooperation? Is he being more forceful? It seemed at his press conference he wanted to keep his conciliatory tone, but is he doing anything to speed this process up other than raising money?
I mean, he has already started taking phone calls with foreign leaders. He has named a chief of staff this week already. So, the chief of staff is sort of looked at as the person who runs the White House and is the voice of the president in sort of all matters. He's started putting together teams to look at, who will be these cabinet members, And they're just, moving forward, doing coronavirus briefings with experts, and they have basically said, we're going to move forward with or without President Trump at this point.
Now, world leaders, Anna, have acknowledged Joe Biden won, and some elected Republicans and former elected Republicans in office have also. I think of Mitt Romney, Senator Mitt Romney, Senator Lisa Murkowski, Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska. So we've seen some acknowledge, but many in the GOP have not. What's the end game with that?
I think absolutely the Georgia Senate races are a big part of this. Republicans need their base to turn out in January in those Senate runoffs to win, to keep both of those seats in the Senate. And obviously, that base includes people who are fans of President Trump. So I think there is some just positioning right now to make sure that Republicans are keeping the base sort of activated. I do think, there's talk that President Trump would run again. And, some of these Republicans live and ran in areas that, their constituents are very supportive of President Trump. So I think they're in a position where they're trying to appease the president and also, save face a little bit with their own constituents.
But Anna, don't Democrats and do Democrats share any of the blame here in breaking this presidential norm? Is this payback by Republicans? I mean, did Democrats start this by sort of throwing a little bit of salt on that in 2016, even though Hillary Clinton conceded?
Yeah, it definitely might be a little bit of payback. I think it is sort of ironic that now we're 2 elections in a row, and the Trump administration has been on both now the receiving end and now is the side kind of saying, we'll pump the brakes, wait a little bit before we certify this. It might be. I mean, there were certainly Democrats early on and continuing through the administration who said, this isn't my president. I don't think he was duly elected. But it certainly did not even come close to what we're talking about right now.
Right. Anna Ashburner, our 2020 elections editor for USA Today. Thanks for joining us here on States of America.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up on States of America, is the war on drugs coming to an end? Voters across the country had ballot initiatives looking at marijuana and other drugs. We're going to talk about that next.
They ran a legalization campaign that was really based around racial justice and social justice.
Let's take a breather from the presidential election to talk drugs, shall we? From Oregon to New Jersey, voters weighed in on drug decriminalization from marijuana and even heroin. Several of these initiatives received overwhelming approval, but that doesn't mean there's not a long road ahead or opposition still out there. Here to talk about New Jersey specifically is Mike Davis, reporter for the Asbury Park Press, part of the USA Today network. Mike, how are you?
Philip, how are you doing? Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem, man. Let me start with you and by saying New Jersey voters approved a referendum last week approving recreational marijuana use. Now, for starters, was that a surprise or was that an expected outcome given the fact that, we've seen the lift on prohibition on marijuana in several other states?
Yeah, no, it was an expected outcome, definitely. It finished a little bit more in support than we thought it would. All the polling had it at about a 61% issue. But when all was said and done, it was about 2/3, 67, 68% of voters approved it. And that's honestly not surprising. This has obviously become a hugely popular issue nationally, and especially in a bipartisan manner. New Jersey is a pretty strong blue state. But even in here, we've had discussions with legislators on both sides of the aisle that are kind of behind this. Even some of our most red Republican counties, marijuana legalization won over there too. It actually won in all 21 of New Jersey's counties.
Now, what does the referendum passing actually do? And what I mean by that is, as far as how old do you have to be? Do you have to be 21, 18 to do marijuana? How much can you buy in state versus if you're someone from out of state? Colorado, Illinois, other states like that have rules. Did the referendum speak to that in New Jersey?
So just about the only restriction that we do know of for sure is 21 years or older. The way New Jersey's ballot process works is that actually all of those other details you just mentioned, those are going to be figured out in 2 ways, partly by the legislature, and the legislature is going to kick a lot of that responsibility to this new body called the Cannabis Regulatory Commission. So unlike a lot of other states where you see these ballot issues that straight up it's going to cost this much in taxes, there will be this many dispensaries, this kind of licenses. A lot of that stuff is being figured out right now. All we really know is that it's going to be legal. It's going to at least be taxed at the state sales tax rate, though there could be another tax added onto that. And then you're going to have to be 21 or older to buy it.
How much did COVID-19 and mail-in voting help or hurt either side in this battle?
So I don't think it changed the outcome. I think no matter what, this is going to be a pretty popular issue. What I think is you saw a little differently is that, until it was passed, marijuana legalization really kind of faded into the background. Now, obviously, you had a presidential election going on, the most important election of our lifetimes, as they say. But it really kind of faded into the background. And a lot of voters weren't necessarily aware this was still on the ballot. I mean, you got to look at New Jersey. This is a state that's talked about legalizing marijuana for the last 3 years. And the fact that it finally happened now, I think a lot of voters were a little bit, kind of tired of hearing about it. And then when push came to shove, they sort of forgot. New Jersey has a problem, too, because our ballot questions are so different than other states. There's a huge drop off when you get from even your local council and board of education races to those ballot questions. Is a big drop off. We don't know what the number is yet, but in previous years, you're talking about 20, 30 point drop off just from going to the local election to the ballot questions. And it's a little bit disconcerting because one thing that was different in New Jersey is that they ran a legalization campaign that was really based around racial justice and social justice. Unlike a lot of states that talk about tax revenue and economic benefits, social justice was the big one for all of these people. That was what was talked about in the ads. That was what was talked about by all of our highest elected officials from Governor Phil Murphy on down. So I think a lot of voters maybe missed out on that. They didn't realize just how big of a deal it was.
Why do you think that was? Why do you think that in New Jersey, they made the focus on racial justice? Is because of cities like Newark and places like that? New Jersey's higher people of color population versus other states?
I think it's more a factor of who was involved. The ACLU of New Jersey was the big driver behind the campaign to vote yes, called NJCAN 2020. And we actually had on a live show a couple of days ago, Amol Sinha, who is the executive director of the ACLU of New Jersey and also the chairman of NJCAN 2020. When he came on board of the ACLU of New Jersey, this became a big priority for him, for the ACLU to get involved in. So in other states, you look at groups like the Marijuana Policy Project that have taken the lead, and they obviously are interested in racial and social justice as well. And that is a part of those campaign in other states. But in New Jersey, it was really a locally driven campaign. And for the local groups, racial and social justice were the big drivers.
Well, weed appears to have become the normalized drug, more accepted among voters, as even mainstream Republicans like former House Speaker John Boehner are investing in marijuana businesses. But heroin, a far more controversial narcotic, was on the ballot in Oregon. Here to discuss and talk about that, nationwide initiatives, including Oregon, is Cassandra Frederique, Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. Cassandra, how are things going?
Thanks for having me.
No problem. Can you explain why legalizing heroin is a good thing? We all came up in the just say no era. How is making heroin legal a good thing for this country?
Well, I would say first we should recognize that no one legalized heroin last week. What happened in Oregon is that we decriminalized drug possession. We decriminalized small amounts of drugs. And so what that means is that we removed criminal penalties for drug possession and actually are using the resources that we have used to criminalize people to invest in drug treatment, recovery services, harm reduction services, housing. Really what Oregonians voted for was for us to deal with addiction as a health issue as opposed to a criminal legal system, a criminal legal issue. And so it's important to note that on Tuesday, what Oregon did was decriminalize drug possession and prioritize health. No one legalized heroin on Tuesday. So I think that's really important to clarify.
Where do you think that comes from? Do you think part of that comes from the fact that so many, let's be honest, so many white people are being arrested and incarcerated for heroin? When I was coming up, like I said, in the just say no era, the idea was that everyone, drug dealers and drug users, were all criminals. Where do you think that motivation is coming from?
Well, I think there's a couple of things happening. We're in the midst of an overdose crisis where so many people are dying. Yes, the conversation and the rhetoric focuses on white people of means, but let's be honest, the overdose crisis is rising dramatically among Indigenous, Black, and Latinx people. And so you have, this is the number one reason why people are dying under the age of 50. And most of it is accidental and preventable. And what we're missing is the kind of conversation that we need to have that's not based in 1980 stigma, but it's actually based in education. The other thing that is important to recognize is that drug possession arrests are the number one arrest in this country. one person gets arrested for simple drug possession every 23 seconds. And after a summer that we've had where people got to the streets and talked about why we need to redistribute the resources that law enforcement has and actually invest in our communities, Measure 110 in Oregon actually does that. It actually says if we want to deal with drug addiction and we want to deal with helping people, then we need to stop criminalizing them and actually put resources in the things that they need. And that's what happened on Tuesday. And I think that that's part of a larger conversation and shift that's happening nationally, where people are realizing that we can't use criminalization to deal with complex human behaviors.
So under the current, I guess, what happened in Oregon, what happens to someone if they are caught possessing a certain amount of heroin? I read on there that how if it's a certain amount, it's decriminalized. What happens to that person or person now?
So if a person in Oregon gets stopped for drug possession, they will either face $100 fine, or they have the option of taking a voluntary health assessment. And so you can either pay for a fine and move on your way, or you can say, you know what, I need help, so I'm going to go get a health assessment. Once they go to the health assessment, they're going to be screened, and then they are going to be given a multitude of options. Now, if someone goes to the health assessment and they say, hey, you know what, this is actually not for me, then they get to move on with their life. The thing that's really important about this is that we're trying to reduce the barriers to getting people to treatment. And we're also trying to disrupt the idea that you have to be punished in order to get help. That's what Oregonians kept saying over and over that they wanted to increase the access for their loved ones to get help, as opposed to increasing access for their loved ones to get punished. I don't know if the war on drugs is coming to an end. I think that we're shaking up the institution of it.
We saw weed on the ballot across the country, and Mike, I want you to get on this as well. Can you all take us through what states did and did not approve recreational use, and how each state is similar or different, but also on the decriminalization end of harsher drugs like heroin? Did we see in the 2020 elections, forget about the presidential race, forget about the Senate races, did we see the country go to a more progressive leaning drug policy nationwide?
Well, I think you had 4 states on the ballot and they all passed. It was New Jersey, Arizona, South Dakota, and Montana. And what I think is super interesting about that is that you have a state like New Jersey that is a blue state, tried and true. You have a state like Arizona that we're seeing is becoming more moderate, more of a purple state. And then you have South Dakota and Montana that are Republican strongholds that both went for President Trump pretty clearly. So it just kind of shows you that even in Republican states like that, marijuana legalization is still something voters want to see, and it is becoming a more bipartisan issue.
Sandra, do you think this is a sign, like Mike said, it didn't just happen in blue states? Montana and South Dakota are certainly not blue states by any measure, any yardstick. Is the war on drugs coming to an end?
I don't know if the war on drugs is coming to an end. I think that we're shaking up the institution of it, right? I think more people are asking better questions. We're having critical thinking skills, because the thing is that the overdose crisis has shifted our thinking on it, because so many people are being impacted in different ways. And we're at this moment where people are asking the right questions. Why are we putting so much money in law enforcement? Why are we not having the kind of resources that we need for people to get help? Why is cannabis made illegal? Even the other thing that happened this last week was that, the state of Oregon also passed a ballot initiative for legalize psilocybin, magic mushrooms, for therapeutic use. And then in DC, they made mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority for policing. So what you're seeing over and over again is Americans are saying, we don't need this to be dealt with in the criminal justice system. We need more money for help for our people and more research. And so I don't think it's over. I just think that Americans are showing that they're willing to try something else.
And if I could add one more thing, Philip, I think an interesting thing too is, like you said, this has been going on for a while now. I mean, Colorado legalized in 2012. Now, in just 8 years, you're talking about now 15 states where voters and the legislature have taken steps to legalize marijuana. And you add on the fact, if you look at the numbers, it's about 1 in 3 Americans live in a state with legal marijuana.
That's right.
And what the rest of us are starting to see is that it wasn't the end of the world. There are issues, and they're going to work through issues, but largely it's something that voters have gotten used to in those states. And I think that's why you're seeing that snowball starting to roll now.
We didn't see weed zombies roaming through the streets.
No, we didn't.
That's right.
Do either of you anticipate national recreational legalization to be around the corner? Do you think that's something that President-elect Joe Biden would adopt. I've also seen conservative commentators like Eric Erickson say that Republicans need to jump on board with this as a more populist, idea. Do you see legalization nationally around the corner?
Absolutely. And part of the reason I say that is because the House Democrats are actually looking at the MORE Act,
Right.
which is the federal bill that would actually deschedule federal cannabis as well as decriminalize, and also put forward racial justice provisions at the federal level. This bill was actually co-sponsored by now Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. While we know that President-elect Biden is still soft on the issue of legalizing cannabis, he most certainly has announced his support on decriminalizing cannabis.
Right.
And it's going to be up to us to hold Vice President-elect Kamala Harris to push her running mate to make the decision that she's already made a few years ago.
Because do you think, though, that, here in my home state of Kentucky, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, this is why Georgia will continue to be so vital, because that will determine who controls the Senate. I've asked him about marijuana on numerous occasions, both medical but also recreational. And Senator McConnell has made it clear he's not a fan of recreational marijuana. Is this going to come down to the Senate in your view?
I think the Senate is where our big fight is. I think it's also hilarious that Senator McConnell has such a strong point on that, because there's only one place in the United States that gets to do cannabis research, and it is in your state of Kentucky. And so there is a lot of work to be done there. And we've also seen McConnell move on hemp. And so he has an understanding about how important this is. And I think it's going to take a lot of effort for us to push forward the space. But I think the movement will always be more powerful than politicians. And I think that's why you see ballot initiatives as the way that are dragging elected officials to where the rest of America is. 67% of Americans want us to legalize cannabis. The elected officials are going to have to get on the boat.
Let me ask both of you, in terms of racial justice, the legalization of marijuana is really only half the battle, right? I mean, that's right. Mike, I want to start with you. Explain how racial justice in particular is at the center of this. And by that, I mean, and I want either one of you I want both of you to chime in on this, but by that, I mean, should people be locked up on weed charges right now in states that legalize pot? Should those people be financially compensated? Cassandra, let me ask that question to you first, actually.
Absolutely. I think that we're at this moment where we have to recognize that cannabis legalization would not have been where it is right now if we did not do the work on policing and racial justice. That is what pushed this conversation forward. Yes, New Jersey really censored it. Other places didn't as much, but we cannot ignore the role that social justice and racial justice has played in the mainstreaming of this issue, and why we are pushing for the MORE Act to be the bill that pushes forward is because it is the bill at the federal level that has most, if not all, of the racial equity provisions that are necessary. We cannot arrest mostly Black and Latino people for cannabis and then legalize it and then lock them out of the industry and keep them locked up in criminalization. Cannabis has to move forward by removing all the criminal penalties associated with marijuana possession. We have to work to use that money to reinvest in the communities that have been over-criminalized. And we need to make sure that the industry is an accessible job opportunity for people that have been locked out of traditional markets, which is why they entered into the illicit drug market. And we have to make sure that they have the opportunity to enter into the current above ground markets.
Mike, I want you to chime in on that part too, because in New Jersey, one thing I noticed in your reporting, right, was after voters approved marijuana, recreational marijuana, and that ballot initiative, you all still have a new bill that's snaking its way through New Jersey's state government. And it's looking to ensure that some of that revenue goes to Black communities, in fact, rather than police departments.
I mean, you're looking at a state like New Jersey where this was an immensely popular issue. And even now, even in a state where racial and social justice was the forefront of the campaign, like I said, now that we take a look at the bill, there's a lot of push by activists that say this isn't enough. I mean, I'll give you one easy example. The way the ballot question was worded, like I said, you're talking about the state sales tax, and that's it, about 6.6%. Now there's a push to add another tax on there, an excise tax like a lot of other states have, with the idea of that being the main driver to push more funding towards communities of color that have been impacted by the war on drugs.
Absolutely. You cannot use racial justice talking points and not actually do racial equity work.
Right. Well, Mike Davis at the Asbury Park Press, reporter down there for us at the USA Today Network. And Cassandra Frederique, who got me together on that Oregon country, by the way, director of the Drug Policy Alliance. Thank you for joining us here on States of America. Thanks for joining us here on States of America with USA Today. We're having honest conversations on the issues that matter most.